introduction, and thanks to all of you for joining in today for this webinar. As was mentioned, my name is Shafeeqa Giarratani, and I am the co-managing shareholder of the Austin, Texas office of Ogletree Deakins. My practice as an employment attorney specifically focuses on OFCCP compliance and federal contractor rules and regulations. Very pleased to speak to you all about these issues that are very near and dear to my heart and a key part of my practice. Our topic today is compliance enforcement in the era of lean in government, and really how to prepare for OFCCP compliance in 2018, what you need to do to get your organization ready as we roll into the new year. Now, I've heard from many of my clients a key question, which is, what is new under the Trump administration for the OFCCP? And I'll tell you all that the answer is that the OFCCP has really gotten very little focus from the Trump administration thus far. As many of you all know, we are still waiting for a new director for the OFCCP. Now, what that means for all of you is that in many ways we're still operating under the rules and the way that the Obama administration led the OFCCP now, because we don't have any new leadership under the Trump administration. But we are seeing a few things that are different, and I'll be talking with you all about those today, as well as all the things that you need to know as we go into 2018 and audits that you may receive for your organization. So let me start off with a little bit of review for everyone, just a quick review to get everyone on the same page in terms of what are the obligations of federal contractors. If you are a federal contractor, have a contract with the government of $50,000 or more, then you're subject to an audit, but you are subject to the obligations of Executive Order 11246 if you have a federal contract as low as $10,000. You're also subject to compliance with the Rehabilitation Act and VEVRA, or the Jobs for Veterans Act. Those that have $50,000 or more in federal contracts, or $100,000 or more for other laws and regulations, must do written affirmative action programs and update those annually. A key component is also outreach to minorities, women, individuals with disabilities, as well as veterans, certain record-keeping requirements, as well as being subject to OFCCP compliance evaluations. Now, what the government is looking for in any audit is to ensure that any company that takes federal dollars is not discriminating and is ensuring equal employment opportunity for all of its employees. That company is also targeting outreach specifically to underutilized groups, generally minorities and women, individuals with disability, and veterans. And also showing that not only are they targeting these groups, but they are setting forth goals and making key efforts to meet those goals annually. Now, as we discussed, there are three major federal affirmative action laws: Executive Order 11246, which covers affirmative action to women and minorities; the Rehabilitation Act, which covers affirmative action for federal contractors for individuals with disabilities; and the Vietnam-era Veterans Readjustment Assistance Act, otherwise known as VEVRA, which requires affirmative actions for certain covered veterans if you are a covered federal contractor or subcontractor. Now, we'll briefly cover what is in your affirmative action plans. So, under Executive Order 11246, in your AAP, or Affirmative Action Plan, you're required to identify problem areas, develop and execute action-oriented programs, design audit systems to make sure that you are fulfilling your requirements as a federal contractor, and maintain data analysis. The data analysis that's required in an Executive Order 11246 Affirmative Action Plan includes a profile of your organization, requirements that the federal contractor group jobs that are alike, and then determine what is available in the labor pool and internally, and determine what the utilization is at the company, and if there's any underutilization compared to what's available in the applicable labor pool, to put forth placement goals. Now, every federal contractor is required to determine the availability of qualified minorities and females in the contractor's reasonable recruitment area. Now, that is determined by looking not only at external availability, which is determined through census data, but also through internal availability, feeder groups, recruitment groups that are internal at the organization. Once we determine that availability, it is required for the federal contractor to compare the percentage of minorities and females within the contractor's workforce or the incumbents with what's available out there. Where there is a difference, there is a requirement to have a placement goal. And a placement goal is just that. It is a goal. It is certainly not a quota, but it's a goal that the federal contractor puts forth to where there is underutilization, to have improvement and or more outreach in that area in the following year. So, and getting more into the meat of the presentation with that bit of review, how is all of this really tested and enforced, and what are we seeing from the OFCCP, and what can you expect in 2018? Well, as many of you all know, the OFCCP enforces all of these requirements through either a random or a complaint-driven audit process. By random, every year, companies that have federal contracts are required to submit an EEO-1, and if you check yes to answer to the question C3, then you are put into a giant pool in a computer where you can be randomly selected for an audit annually. Federal contractors can also be selected for an audit through a complaint. If an individual at your organization submits a complaint to the OFCCP of unequal treatment based on race, gender, disability, or veteran status, then the OFCCP can come and investigate for those reasons. Now, interestingly, we have seen a slight uptick in complaint-driven OFCCP audits. And we're not quite sure why that's the case, but there has been more and more complaint-driven audits. Not a ton as usual, but a slight uptick. Now, after you are selected for an audit, whether that is random or complaint-driven, then you submit your materials in a desk audit. Within the desk audit, you are required to submit your affirmative action plan, of course, backup data, as well as certain compensation data, which we'll go through throughout this presentation. You're also required to provide a review of documentation of outreach efforts. And we'll talk a little bit more over the next hour about changes that we've seen in terms of outreach efforts documentation that's being required. After you do your desk audit submission, if the OFCCP finds that there are issues, then it can come on-site and do a review on-site. That on-site review may be focused on particular issues, or it can be a more general on-site. But that's the next step in the process. After the on-site review, the OFCCP can then do an off-site analysis of any documentation that it received in the on-site or through the desk audit submission. And finally, if the OFCCP still believes that there are problems after it has conducted its desk audit, on-site and off-site analysis, then it can either ask for a conciliation agreement, and if that is not resolved, move to enforcement. If the OFCCP finds no issues during that process, then it can issue a letter of compliance, something that federal contractors are always happy to receive. And after that, another audit cannot be conducted for 2 years following that letter of compliance. There's really 3 key areas that we have seen the OFCCP focus on traditionally in audits, and that we are and believe that they will continue to focus on in 2018. And those are utilization and goals, personnel activity, with the highest of those being hiring activity, but sometimes as well promotions and terminations, and finally compensation. We'll be talking about each of those key audit area focuses that we've seen and what you can expect in 2018. Now, one of the things that we have seen since the Trump administration started is there has been fewer audits initiated, and with some regions totally skipping cycles of sending out new audit letters. Now, some federal contractors have thought that that is a cause for a whoop and the champagne to start, that there are less audits, but actually what we're finding is in many ways it's quite the opposite, because although we are seeing fewer new audits being initiated, we are seeing the run time for audits go longer. And so the OFCCP is tending to dig much deeper, ask for much more data, and really lengthen audits and make them much more detail-oriented than we have traditionally seen in the past. So let's talk a little bit about what I call the bread and butter of the OFCCP audit process, and that is hiring. Traditionally, and it's still the case, expected to be the same in 2018, most of the OFCCP's conciliations and collection of dollars from federal contractors has to do with the hiring process. So as you prepare for an OFCCP audit, your organization or your clients, what is so important is to focus and get ready for a very and increasingly thorough examination of your hiring process. So here are some things that I recommend that you do. The first is good documentation. Now, this has always been the hallmark of human resources and good employment policies is good documentation. It is no different for being a federal contractor. So you really want to have documentation of every step of the hiring process. Certainly documentation of your basic qualifications for the job. That needs to be in writing. You want to have documentation of what happened for every applicant throughout the process, documentation of what happened in the interview, and certainly good documentation of why someone was hired and not hired. Now, I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into this specific area because, as I said, it is the bread and butter of OFCCP audits. What is crucially important as you prepare for an OFCCP audit is your disposition codes, because disposition codes are how you document every step of the hiring process. Now, here is something key to keep in mind about disposition codes. There are really two purposes for each disposition code. The first purpose is to determine whether or not a candidate is an applicant that should be included in the numbers that you report to the OFCCP. That's the first purpose of every disposition code. Second purpose is, if that person is an applicant, to explain why they were hired or why they were not hired. If a disposition code does not meet either of those two purposes, then that disposition code is not helping you during an audit and is not good documentation. So keep in mind the two purposes of every disposition code. First, is this person an applicant or not? And second, if they are an applicant, why did we hire that person and why didn't we hire that person? So let's talk a little bit about the first reason for every disposition code, and that is this candidate an applicant under the OFCCP's applicant rules or not? Now, to be an applicant under the OFCCP's applicant rule, you have to first submit an expression of interest, second, be considered for the job, third, have the basic qualifications for the job, and fourth, not have self-remove yourself prior to being given an offer. So when you think about your disposition code, those distinctions matter. You want to have in your disposition codes whether or not that person met the basic qualifications or not. That should certainly be a disposition code. I find that it is helpful to have a disposition code that says does not meet basic qualifications and lists things like does not meet basic qualifications experience, does not meet basic qualifications education, but include those specifically in your disposition codes. That'll tell you whether someone should not be in the applicant pool and thus removed from the reporting to the OFCCP. Second, and this is one of the most underutilized disposition codes that really I typically see, and that is whether or not the applicant was considered or not considered. Remember, when we are determining whether a candidate is in or out of the applicant pool that we're reporting to the OFCCP, one of the factors is, did we consider that person? Did we actually look at their application? And so if we did not consider that person, we need to code them that way and remove them from the numbers from the applicant pool that we're reporting to the OFCCP. Now, I think that this is one of the most underutilized disposition codes because there's a feeling out there among our recruiters that they must consider every applicant. And so when they don't want to put on there that they haven't considered that applicant. And what I find oftentimes is they're using other codes instead of just putting that we did not consider that applicant. The truth of the matter is it is absolutely okay to put we did not consider the applicant, and we should. When there are 500 individuals applying to a job, it's just unreasonable to believe that our recruiters are able to get through all of those applications. And it's important as part of the training of our recruiters to be clear we need to use the not considered applicant when we truly do not consider that applicant. That allows us to meet one of the two purposes of every disposition code, which is removing the applicant from the pool. Now, another good distinction that matters is whether or not that person self-removed themselves. Remember, if an individual self-removed themselves, then they are also not a true applicant, should not be reported as part of the numbers of applicants to the OFCCP. What's important is if this individual failed to show up for an interview. If the individual failed to show up for an interview or failed to return a call twice, they have self-removed, and those are individuals that should be removed from the applicant pool. Now, I said that there were two things that every disposition code must do. First, help us determine if this is a true applicant according to the Internet Applicant Rule. And second, if they are an applicant, explain to us why we did not hire this person, or in the converse, why we did. So looking at the reasons for a rejection is so important. We want to be specific because if we do have adverse impact, we want to be able to explain to the OFCCP that the reason that we made this decision was due to a legitimate non-discriminatory reason. We want to stay away from dispositions like better qualified applicant. That doesn't tell us anything. We would hope the better qualified applicant was the one that was hired. And we really hardly ever want to use other. We want to use things very specific, like we did not hire this person because their experience was not as good as another candidate. We did not hire this person because they did not come across professional in the interview. All those are extremely important. Now, I spent quite a bit of time on the documentation of hiring side because I believe that it is crucial to doing well in an audit on the hiring process. But another key part is invitations to self-identify. These are, of course, voluntary, but we want to make sure, because it helps when we are putting together our adverse impact, that as many individuals as possible have self-identified. The way that we do this, although it is voluntary, is to really inform our employees of the reason why we need this self-identification. Let them know that we're not just asking for no reason, but this is crucial to the reporting that we do to the federal government. For those that have struggled with self-identification, in particular for individuals with disabilities, it is a good thing to encourage individuals with disabilities to self-identify. The OFCCP has a fairly decent video that it has that I've seen a lot of clients have success with showing that video in addition to an email explaining why it's so important that folks identify as part of the reporting process. Now, what happens if the OFCCP, although you have good documentation, sees adverse impact against a particular group, women, minorities, etc., in your hiring data? Now, here's what we've seen that the OFCCP does in that case. It's going to request your applicant flow, and that's why it's so important that you have good, solid documentation in that applicant flow, because the OFCCP will see what exactly you documented in terms of disposition codes. The OFCCP will also request copies of all applications and any related documents, including interview notes. The OFCCP will request electronic files dealing with the hiring process. The OFCCP can also interview and get statements from any personnel involved in the hiring process. This will typically be your human resources officers as well as any hiring managers. They'll request anything in writing that you have regarding selection procedures. And they can claim systemic discrimination in hiring if you cannot defend your hiring practices, if you cannot show that there was no adverse impact, or if there is, through good documentation and disposition codes, that there was a legitimate reason for each hiring decision made. So again, documentation is crucial to defending your hiring practices. But also key to this, and what we have been seeing more and more, is the OFCCP really delving in to federal contractors' policies and practices. So if you have not looked at your policies, your hiring policies and procedures for a while, it's a good idea to dust these off and make sure they are updated. If you have not looked at your basic qualifications in a while, it is a good idea to take these out, dust them off, and revise them too. Remember that the OFCCP looks at those written basic qualifications as part of determining who should be in the applicant pool or not. So it's important, and really we suggest annually that our clients and federal contractors take a look at what they have in writing. The OFCCP is looking at more and more, especially any written hiring procedures and any written basic qualifications. Now, as many of you all know, that if the OFCCP finds systemic discrimination in hiring, or it finds adverse impact, it can request back pay. Typically, it requests 2 years for every person that it claims that you should have hired were it not for the adverse impact. It'll also request a monetary settlement of benefits as well as interest. And part of what always comes with it is hiring. Hiring people that you previously rejected. And what is non-negotiable is that there will be a press release. So these things are certainly not kept confidential. All of this underscoring why it is crucial that you are ready and your organization is ready to defend your hiring practices. Of course, you always want to avoid any direct evidence of discrimination. Now, this is not a problem that most organizations have, thankfully, but it happens, and it's something to be aware of. Remember I said that if the OFCCP finds adverse impact, it's going to look through your documents, and it's likely going to come on site. And when the OFCCP comes on site, as I mentioned, they're going to want to talk to human resources and hiring managers. I have seen, very unfortunately, that sometimes our hiring managers that the OFCCP speaks with might say things offhanded that the OFCCP takes for direct evidence of discrimination. I have seen things like, well, we don't have a lot of drivers because women don't want to drive. They don't like this type of work. The OFCCP, although some folks might say that is offhanded, will believe that is direct evidence of discrimination. Those are the things we want to avoid, and we certainly want to avoid someone in human resources or otherwise describing any efforts that the company has as things like quotas. Well, how many of women would I need to hire to make this go away or to make it look okay? It's very important when the OFCCP comes on site to do very good, solid training and preparation with our managers and our human resources so that they are prepared to answer questions and really go through a heavy examination with the OFCCP. You also want to avoid having adverse impact, and certainly having adverse impact and providing that to an OFCCP in an audit by doing frequent analysis. If there is adverse impact in your data in hiring, you might find that at the end of the year when you're preparing your affirmative action plan. But if you are doing more frequent analysis, and I have some clients that really review these things quarterly or at least twice a year, so that if there is adverse impact, they can go in and say, well, do we have adverse impact because we have an issue, or is there a problem with our data? Those of you that have been through an audit and have problems with your data know that that can sometimes take a long time to clean up. So doing frequent analysis can really help with that process. Remember, it's not only the numbers in an audit, it's the reasons behind those numbers. So even where we have adverse impact, when I have a contractor that has good disposition codes and says, yes, we see adverse impact here towards women, but if you look behind the data, the women that were not selected were not qualified or didn't show up to the interview, or when they did show up to the interview, were not prepared for that interview. We're going to be in good shape in those types of audits, and that's the type of documentation that you need. And training decision makers to always follow the process is critical in any audit. Where I've seen some audits go awry is where our decision makers don't follow process, where they are handpicking individuals maybe that they know from somewhere else instead of following the hiring process, where they see a slate of candidates and instead of interviewing each of the qualified candidates, pick one and don't go through the process. Those things hurt us in an OFCCP audit because the OFCCP questions, well, why is this manager not following process? Is it because they have an animus towards a particular racial group or a gender or a particular status of disability or veteran? So training our managers on the importance of following process is also crucial to sailing through an audit, and certainly under this heightened scrutiny and longer audits that we're seeing with an OFCCP, doing well in those types of audits as well. Let's switch gears. Part of the OFCCP focus on an audit, as I said, the highest focus is always the hiring process. But we have also started to see the OFCCP look more at promotions. And where we see this particular issue come up more and more is in the steering context. The OFCCP has identified a focus area in audits in what it calls steering, which is where it says that sometimes men or women or particular minority groups are steered into higher or lesser paying jobs, and that some individuals are chilled from applying into certain jobs by management. Now, these types of claims are very difficult for the OFCCP to prove, but they are focusing on it more and more. And they do this first by looking at your promotions, also by looking at your hiring activity, and also sometimes by looking even at compensation. This is a very multifaceted approach that the OFCCP looks at when determining whether there has been steering. But in particular, and here's what you need to think about for your organization in an audit, is that the OFCCP is skeptical of any employer picking and choosing. They don't like a non-well-defined process because they believe that when there is a lack of process or a lot of discretion of process, that is where bias can slip in. What's important when you look at your organization and how promotions work is the OFCCP is much more likely to pass you through an audit if you have a traditional bid system. And by that I mean a job is posted for a promotion and people apply to it, and that there is consistency in process and documentation. The organizations I have seen struggle on this issue in an audit is where there are tons of promotions that occur without anyone bidding on them, or where there are promotions that occur where people are promoted in job, or what I sometimes call as inline promotions, which is there's no bidding, but your job has now expanded and you take on a new role without competing for that job. Having a competitive process in a promotion as much as possible is really key to sometimes avoiding these steering claims or promotion-focused audits. Another area that we have seen the OFCCP focus on and really start to focus quite heavily during the Obama administration, and we are seeing continue to focus during the Trump administration, is on compensation issues and systemic compensation issues. And what they're looking at in particular is, are minorities and women paid less than non-minorities or men, or vice versa? And aren't these differences explained by legitimate, non-discriminatory factors that we can think of, like education, tenure, performance, etc.? So those are the key questions that the OFCCP is looking at when it looks at compensation. Now, I like to tell clients that handling a compensation audit is not easy. If you have been through it, you know that it is not an easy process and takes a comprehensive approach. And so what I explain to my clients is that there are really 4 steps to prepare for a pay audit by the OFCCP. And here they are. 1, to do a proactive pay analysis and self-audit in a comprehensive one, and I'll talk to you about that. 2nd, manage your pay practices. 3rd, investigate complaints. And 4, have strong documentation of your pay processes. Let's talk through each of those in a little bit more depth. The first thing to prepare for a compensation audit by the OFCCP is to do a proactive, privileged pay analysis. Now let's break that up into pieces. First of all, why do a pay analysis at all? First is that you are required as a federal contractor to do some sort of analysis of your pay, in the same way that you're required to analyze your promotions, your hiring, and your termination. Now, the OFCCP does not require a certain way that you do that pay analysis. You're just required to do one. So because it's a requirement, it's certainly something that you should do. Now, I suggest you do a very comprehensive one, which I'll be telling you about in a moment. Now, it's also important to do a proactive privileged pay analysis to know what you're up against, to know what the OFCCP will be looking at during an audit, and to be able to resolve the issue or explain it at the very least before an audit. Now, what about this privileged piece that I put in here? I also believe that doing your proactive pay audit under privilege is crucial. You don't want to be required to produce that pay audit in the actual audit, the pay analysis in the actual audit, or to have to produce it in another case, in a lawsuit about pay. And so we want to protect that pay analysis through privilege. Now, what do I mean by privilege? Now, you establish and maintain privilege. Privilege is a special protection for information that is developed with your attorney. And the basis behind this is that in order to get good legal advice, companies, individuals are allowed to be completely honest with their attorneys, and certain information and analysis in order to protect ourselves and get legal advice is protected. And so you want to have this proactive pay analysis protected by privilege by using outside counsel, by having that counsel lay out in an engagement letter the reasons it's doing this proactive privileged audit. And then once you establish that it is a privileged pay analysis, you have to maintain the privilege. And by that I mean it's no good to have protected information if everybody in the organization has this pay analysis. If we're forwarding it around to this person, it's on people's desks. You want to have a control group where only certain folks that need to know the information behind the pay analysis are privy to that pay analysis. And you want to maintain the confidentiality. Now obviously, no analysis is good if no one knows about it. So part of the process of doing a pay analysis is, as I said, making sure it's privileged, keeping it confidential, but also determining what you do want to report out, what is important that you give to your executive. And typically we will do an executive summary with some of the high-level issues that are important for our executives to know about, or higher-level management, while keeping some of the details still privileged with a smaller control group. Now, how do we do a proactive privilege pay analysis? Well, the key factors for any pay analysis is, first, we need to compare apples to apples. It doesn't do any good to say that the CEO gets paid differently than an admin assistant. We know that. That doesn't show any type of discrimination. So we've got to be comparing similarly situated individuals or like jobs. After that, we also need to think about what affects pay. Again, it doesn't tell us anything if we compare two people in a job, but one has 15 years of experience and another has 1 year of experience. We need to compare people that are both in similar jobs and also compare people based on and taking into account factors that affect pay. Now, the types of analysis that the OFCCP does, and so you should be doing for your organization, is for smaller groups they do something called a cohort analysis. And a cohort analysis is, in short, an analysis where we look at a small group of people, look at their personnel files, look at their experience, and determine, does it make sense that these people are paid either similarly or differently? And are there any differences that are not legitimate but look like that they are based on either gender or race? Now, a regression analysis is for much larger groups. And in short, it is a statistical analysis that takes into account like jobs as well as factors that affect pay, like education, experience, and performance. A regression analysis takes all those factors into account statistically and sees, is there still a difference that we cannot explain, although we've looked at like people and although we've looked at factors that affect jobs? And if that difference is very large, then we'll say we have an issue here that we need to look into more. Now, I said if that difference is too large. That's what we're looking for in this statistical regression analysis. Well, how do we know if the difference is too large? Well, what the OFCCP looks at and what courts have looked at for a long time is the difference what's called statistically significant? A difference is statistically significant, courts and the OFCCP have determined, if the difference is 2 standard deviations from the mean. Now, we want to think of this as if you think of a normal bell curve. There are differences that perhaps people have, and we think about the bell curve when we were all taking tests in school, that there were differences on what people made on the test that would fall in a normal bell curve. But some people were far out from that middle, from that normal amount of differences. And that's exactly what the 2 standard deviations does. If you are 2 standard deviations out from a normal differences, then the OFCCP says that's a difference that's significant. That's a difference that we do not expect. And that's when the OFCCP will look to you and say, you've got some explaining to do. So what happens when you find, after you do this pay analysis, that there are some disparities and some statistically significant ones? Let's say 2 standard deviations or more. Don't panic. That sometimes happens. And what's important is you investigate. When we do a pay analysis and we find out that there are differences that are off the norm, that doesn't mean that there's discrimination. It just means that there's something going on that we haven't accounted for. Now, it could be discrimination, but it could be that the data is wrong. It could be that there's another factor we didn't take into account. Perhaps our analysis looked at education, but forgot to look at performance. So the most important thing we do is investigate when we see that there are differences that we can't first explain. If we still can't explain those differences, then that's when we think about making adjustments. And typically we try to roll those adjustments into the next merit pay cycle where we can. Step number 2, you want to manage pay practices to get ready for a pay audit. What's important is that you have guidelines on pay to ensure consistency. Have guidelines that are funneled out to your recruiters and your managers on how you will set starting pay. Have guidelines on how you will set increases, and have guidelines on promotions. Now, it's a best practice to really make sure that you have an annual analysis of your merit increase and really roll up your pay analysis into that process. So before you move on a merit increase, you've analyzed your pay and made sure that it makes sense from a non-discriminatory perspective. Step number 3, investigate complaints. Now, this may seem obvious, but I found that with quite a few organizations, you know, when an employee comes to a manager or HR talks about sexual harassment, they know what to do. They know that's a complaint that needs to be investigated. But I will say that too often we find that when an employee comes and says, you know, well, I'm upset about my pay, that the manager says, well, you know, I'm upset about your performance, and doesn't take this as the same issue that they would if there was a complaint of sexual harassment or discrimination. We need to take complaints regarding pay seriously. Train managers to report those complaints, HR to handle them and investigate them promptly, report back to the complainant where we need to, or make adjustments. But investigating complaints really helps to root out issues from the ground level and hopefully resolve them before they become a complaint to the OFCCP, either in an interview or them going directly to the OFCCP. Fourth and final step in having and preparing for a pay audit, a comp audit by the OFCCP, is having strong documentation. You want to make sure that you, just as you have documented your hiring process, that you have good documentation around the pay process. Now, I find that, unfortunately, this can be a hole in many organizations. We'll know why we fired someone. Sometimes we'll know why we hired someone, but why we gave John a raise in 2016 and not the same one to Sally, well, we don't have that same type of documentation. And so you want to think about and look in your own organization to make sure that you have got strong documentation around pay. Create forms for documenting reasons. You might even make it as simple as on your performance evaluation annually saying this person did or did not get a raise, and if they did, check the box why. Strong performance, extra efforts, whatever it is, and have the employees sign off on that pay increase, just as you would have them sign off on their performance evaluation. You also want to make sure that if you do a pay analysis and you notice, you know, I'd love to know prior experience because that's a factor that affects pay, but I don't have that information tracked. Start tracking that information now that you're able to give it to the OFCCP, able to analyze it in your pay audits of yourself. Now, another area that you want to be able to defend yourself in an audit, and specifically in the audits of 2018, is termination decisions. Now, traditionally, we've seen that the OFCCP does not focus all that much in an audit on your termination data, even when there's adverse impact. We have been seeing a slight uptick, and as the OFCCP does deeper dives into data, then occasionally asking questions about your termination decisions, especially where there's adverse impact. Here's what you want to do. Be prepared to explain the reasons for the termination. Have your policies ready. The OFCCP may want to conduct interviews of the hiring managers, or sometimes it'll even conduct interviews of the folks left or the former employees. So be ready for that. But what's always important here is strong documentation to explain the reasons. Now, under the Obama administration, we had a new focus on Section 503 and VEVRA, Veteran, Individuals with Disabilities and our Veterans Affirmative Action Plans. You all, many of you know, that's required in those plans is your policy statement, review of personnel processes, anti-harassment statements, and now, even more, looking at certain data regarding who applies and who was hired. Now, the OFCCP during the Obama administration and now in the beginning of the Trump administration, we have not seen a very strong focus in this area. But we still have seen some focus from the OFCCP as they still kind of ramp up on the new regulations. And here's where we have seen that focus in particular. They are making sure that you've got your equal opportunity clause in your covered subcontracts and purchase orders. They are making sure that you have corrected all your external advertisements to make sure that you say disability and veteran as opposed to D and V. They are asking for reasonable accommodation information. They're asking what accommodations were requested, which ones were denied, and why. They're making sure that you are doing your self-identification properly. They're also making sure that you are listing your job openings externally with the unemployment office, even going so far as to check that themselves or ask for your data on the same. But perhaps the biggest focus that they have is on your outreach efforts. More and more in audits, we have seen compliance officers ask not only for a simple list of your outreach, but a list of who you have contacted, their telephone numbers, their emails, and what was the result of that contact. You want to make sure that you have a spreadsheet with that type of information. That is what you need to make sure that you are prepared for the types of outreach audits that the OFCCP is continuing to conduct and doing a deeper dive on for veterans and individuals with disabilities. Now, with that, we have a short time left, and so I will open up the floor for any questions that anyone may have. And I will say that the questions can be received in two ways. Either you can put your questions in the chat function at the left-hand side of your screen, and I will also open up the audio mode for any questions and answers if anyone would like to ask a question orally. And so I see a few of you are typing now, so we'll give it a minute while those are coming through.
Okay, this is the thing. Another thing we can do.
Go ahead, Rathin.
Yeah, I was just wondering if we should collect some of these and go through the next couple of slides and come back, because some people may drop off at 3 o'clock. That's when it's supposed to end. I think people are having difficulty to speak because in the QA mode, and we don't know that ask a question button, whether they found it. Okay, so there is a question on the chat. Can you see?
Yeah. Question that we received is, can an employer ask an applicant pre-hire if they are a veteran? And the answer is yes. You can ask that question. There was some debate about whether you could ask their particular veteran status, meaning what category that they were in versus are they just a covered veteran. We haven't seen too much focus on the OFCCP from this, but we've seen many federal contractors asking, and you're actually required to ask pre-hire about veteran status, both are you a covered veteran or the particular category. The other question we have is, will there be a deeper dive in 2018 regarding the termination regulations in 2018? And I will say, and regarding the more detailed reasons is the question. We have seen more of a deeper dive in 2017 regarding terminations, and I would say that typically this comes when there has been a large-scale layoff at the organization. If you've had a layoff, many terminations, and in particular if there's adverse impact associated with that you've submitted to the OFCCP, then it is a good idea to beforehand collect your documentation. Make sure that you're ready to answer questions about your terminations and to provide good reasons and good documentation behind why that's happening. I think that we are almost done with our time. Remaining questions I can be happy to answer by email or later by phone. And Rathin, I think that you had a few more closeout comments that you wanted to make.
Sure. So if we can move to the next slide and go to the listen only.
So I've opened up the audio mode. Rathin, I think you had a few closing comments. Well, it looks like we are having difficulty with our final audio, but as was mentioned in the, and I'll say, can you all hear me now? And it looks like you all can, and getting some responses. So with that, we will conclude, I believe, and I will first say that thank you, JOBfindah, for putting on this excellent webinar. Thank you for all your questions. I do believe that there are a few questions I didn't get to, but happy to follow up with each of you. We will be distributing the slides to this presentation. A couple of you asked about that, and I am always available to answer any questions that you have. Thank you all for joining us on behalf of Ogletree Ogletree Deakins, as well as JOBfindah, and there is additional information about JOBfindah on the last 2 slides, which we'll be distributing. And with that, thank you all for joining in with us today, and hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day, and happy holidays to all.